Egypt is a country where death was perceived not as an end, but as a beginning, and at the same time as a craft and an art. We are accustomed to contemplating this civilization through the golden display cases of museums and idealized images. Before our eyes appears the impassive mask of Tutankhamun, the monumental pyramids of Giza, and the austere, precise geometry of temples bathing in the sun. These pictures give a sense of eternity, frozen in the facets of stone, but that is only a facade, a carefully polished showcase, a kind of ancient Instagram, censored and created by the pharaohs for posterity. Behind this beautiful shell lay another reality, far more earthly and grim in smell and mood. It smelled not only of incense, myrrh, and blue lotus, but also of rot, dried blood, the sweat of slaves, and the acrid substances used in embalming. Behind the golden gates of the temples were the priests' laboratories, where experiments on human flesh were carried out that would sicken a modern pathologist. In the shadow of the great structures lay pits with dismembered bodies, about which modern notions of ancient aesthetics prefer to remain silent. For a long time, we saw the Egyptians mainly as sages, astronomers, and mathematicians, paying attention to their luminous achievements. However, recent discoveries made using high-resolution computed tomography, new DNA sequencing methods, and mass spectrometry are changing this picture. They outline a society in which pain and violence played a significant role, a society that knew more about poisons than about medicines. In critical periods, this civilization went so far as to devour its own children to survive. Today, we are opening what might be called the Black Book of Egyptology. We will descend into those shafts and underground passages where tourists are not allowed. We will peer into the empty eye sockets of mummies whose deaths were not natural and over which priestly curses hung. These are not myths about gods with animal heads, but a kind of forensic report on crimes committed 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. The evidence has been preserved by the desert's dry climate and has waited its hour for millennia. Prepare yourself. We are entering a zone of biological danger and historical nightmare. The year 1881. Luxor, the west bank of the Nile. Here in the rock face is hidden the famous Deir el-Bahari cache, marked on maps as DB 320. In a deep, narrow shaft hewn into the stone, priests of the 21st dynasty, finding no other way out, hid the mummies of great rulers of the past, hoping to protect them from the endless wave of robberies that had swept Egypt. They brought here the bodies of Ramesses the Great, Seti I, Thutmose III, and laid them side by side, shoulder to shoulder, in the dark, cramped space, stripped of their former treasures, but preserving their shells. But in a corner of that tomb, in the shadow of royal splendor, lay a very different object, a simple, rough cedar sarcophagus, without a name, without gilding, and without the magical inscriptions that open the path to the afterlife. For an ancient Egyptian, the absence of a name on a burial was not merely an omission, it was tantamount to the death of the soul, an erasure from memory and being. So the find was disturbing and baffling. When archaeologists, exhausted from dust and sweltering heat, lifted the lid of that sarcophagus, the sight was shocking. Before them was a face contorted in the grimace of pure, unfeigned animal terror. The mouth was wide open as if in a final, interminable scream that had been stretched across 3,000 years. The jaw was pulled to one side, the neck muscles frozen in their final spasm. The skin was drawn so tight over the cheekbones, it looked as if it might split. Even the desiccated eyes seemed to hold a plea and a pain. In the catalog, this person was listed under the dry, impersonal name Man-E, but it took time and technological progress for the mystery to be heard differently. In 2012, the Egyptian Mummy Project, led by Dr. Zahi Hawass, placed this mummy in a medical computed tomography scanner. The images spoke the language of science. This was not a natural death and not an embalmer's mistake. The diagnosis was different, a special ritual execution designed not only to destroy the body, but to annihilate the soul itself. The internal organs had not been removed. The brain, heart, lungs, and intestines remained inside. In Egypt's scorching climate, these organs decomposed, turning into a black, sticky dust that filled the chest cavity and skull. Leaving the organs meant condemning the corpse to slow decay from within. This was seen as a curse. And one more, no less gruesome fact: the mummy had not been wrapped in pure linen, as ritual required, but in a sheepskin. This final touch made the occurrence even more sinister, and completed the image of the man whose face had frozen in terror and silence. For the ancient Egyptians, wool was a symbol of impurity. Those wearing woolen garments were not admitted into temples. Priests wore only linen, and any appearance in the sanctuary in wool was regarded as burial in an animal hide was perceived not merely as an insult. It meant the theological annihilation of the person, equating him with a beast and excluding him from the community of humans and gods. In one discovered burial, the deceased's hands and feet had been bound with leather straps so tightly that clear marks from the ropes remained on the bones. It was obvious he had died in fetters. Y-chromosome genetic analysis produced a staggering result that tied together forensics and history. This unclean man had the same haplogroup and genetic markers as the great pharaoh Ramesses II, who rested in the same other hiding place. The degree of kinship was 99.9%. The scientists' conclusion was unequivocal. They were father and son. The so-called screaming mummy received a new name and face: Prince Pentawer, the man who rose against the living God. To understand the circumstances, one must turn to the Turin Judicial Papyrus, a document that reads like the Nuremberg trial record or a transcript of a mafia court. It all took place in 1155 BCE in the palace at Medinet Habu. Egypt was already weakening, and the Bronze Age was drawing to a close. One of the pharaoh's junior wives, Tia, decided the old king lived too long and sought to place her son Pentawer on the throne, bypassing the rightful heir. This was not merely a knife in the back, but a full-scale internal war in the palace. The conspirators acted on a large scale. The papyrus dryly lists the evidence found on the accused: wax effigies for targeted harm, scrolls with spells designed to sap strength, poisons. The text explicitly records poisons that spare no limbs. It was a magical war combined with a political conspiracy. The plotters bribed the head of the harem and the palace cupbearer, then penetrated the Holy of Holies, the god's bedchamber. Historians long debated whether the assassination attempt succeeded and whether Ramses survived. A CT scan of Ramses II's mummy, performed the same day as the examination of Pentawer, lifted the veil hidden beneath the wrappings. Under layers of oiled linen on the pharaoh's neck, a wound was found, unnoticed for 3,000 years. Ramses's throat had been cut, a blow struck from behind with a sharp, heavy dagger or sword. The cut passed below the larynx, severing the trachea, esophagus, and all major arteries, reaching almost to the spine. Death was instantaneous, although the embalmers apparently tried to conceal this fact. In the opened wound, they placed an amulet, the Eye of Horus, a symbol of healing, and bandaged the neck so tightly that the head was securely fixed and could not fall off. The killers achieved their aim. The pharaoh did indeed fall, but the conspirators did not win the final victory. The loyal guard, together with the rightful heir Ramses IV, crushed the rebellion. The trial began, harsh, public, and exemplary. The papyrus mentions Pentawer. He was found guilty and left in place. The phrase that he killed himself was a bureaucratic euphemism. He was given a choice between an honorable death and a form of suicide. The neck tomogram of the mummy, whose cry was frozen through the ages, recorded an unusual dilation of the trachea and compression of the soft tissues under the jaw. Judging by these signs, he either hanged himself or took a poison that caused suffocation and a laryngeal spasm. Such lightning-fast stiffening of the muscles is medically associated with extreme stress immediately before death. The embalmers, who hated the patricide, did not perform the usual rituals. They did not close his mouth, did not relax his muscles. They simply threw the twisted, still-warm body into a crate, covered it with an unclean pelt, and sprinkled it with lime and soda. The lime, entering into a chemical reaction, burned the skin even after death, drying it to the consistency of parchment. In this way, the body was condemned to eternal torment. His cries seem to have been preserved by the chemistry and the hatred of those who betrayed him. We are looking not at a simple mummy, but at a frozen second of the traitor's agony, caught between worlds, as if the moment of death had been frozen and put on display. Attention shifts from a personal family drama to state terror, the scale of which staggers the imagination. Abydos, one of the oldest cities, the place where, according to tradition, the head of the god Osiris lay, sacred ground and a gateway to the afterlife. Here, in the sands of el-Kab, rest the first kings of Egypt, members of the first dynasty, around 3000 BCE. Archaeologists from the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University, working for decades, excavated the complex around the tomb of King Aha. When the archaeologists opened the royal burial and reached that part of the necropolis, they were confronted with a scene more like the site of a mass execution or the traces of a cult's ritual suicide. Around the main burial chamber, in strict, almost perfect geometric rows, lay hundreds of small rectangular graves, a total of 339 burials. These graves did not contain the bodies. The tombs held women adorned with exquisite ornaments of lapis lazuli and gold. Dwarfs, whose role in Egyptian society was valued almost as highly as gold, employed as dancers, wardrobe keepers, and jewelers. Scribes with palettes of paint, as if ready to record orders for eternity. Favorite hunting dogs with ivory collars. Even tame lions, buried with honors. Bone analysis revealed a terrible truth. All these people had died on the same day. They were young, between 20 and 35 years old, robust and healthy, with no signs of epidemic or aging. Such a mass departure accompanied the burial of the monarch. This was the attendant sacrifice that scholars often call retainer sacrifice. The idea is so simple it is terrifying. The pharaoh was regarded as a deity and could not go to the afterlife alone. He required servants, wives, cooks, and guards to continue his service in the duat. It did not look at all like a voluntary departure. No traces of sword wounds or decapitation were found on the skeletons, as was practiced in other cultures. Forensic scientists examined the teeth and noticed a pinkish tint to the dentin around the roots, a sign of capillary rupture from high pressure. The Egyptians were adept at handling toxic substances and knew how to extract hydrocyanic acid from peach or almond kernels. Picture the scene: a funeral feast, hundreds of people in white linen, and their finest jewelry. Archaeologists also found traces of blows from blunt objects to the occiputs of some victims. Obviously, not everyone agreed to take the poison voluntarily. Those who resisted or lost their composure were subdued with clubs and thrown into pre-dug pits. Over the graves, they heaped mounds and erected stone stelae with names and titles. The king's favorite singer, the keeper of the royal sandals, and other honorary offices were listed as if those positions could accompany the deceased into the afterlife. The pharaoh departed into eternity, literally stepping over the corpses of his closest companions. In early times, it was common to bury the ruler's closest friends with him. This grim practice did not last long in historical terms. By the Second Dynasty, it had killing 300 leading masters, architects, artists, administrators, every 20 to 30 years proved economically unviable. The state lost not only people, but their skills, experience, and memory. Living servants turned out to be more valuable than the dead for governing a vast country. Thus arose the practice of replacing living people with small figurines, ushabti, the answerers, miniature dolls of clay, wood, or faience. Magic replaced ritual killing. Instead of a person, a figurine was placed in the tomb, inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead. These dolls were meant to answer the king's call in the afterlife. "I am here," the spells declared when service was required in the court of the netherworld. This clay army saved the lives of many real people, substituting flesh and blood with a symbolic likeness. But the remains under the sand still preserve the memory of a time when loyal. Next, we move to the era Egyptologists call the Dark Ages, the first intermediate period, when the magnificent Old Kingdom collapsed. It was a time of decline. Pyramids ceased to be built, statues of the gods gathered dust, the familiar order cracked. Scientists sought the cause of the collapse of the great state that had built the Sphinx not in chronicles but in climatologists' laboratories. Analyses of the silts of Lake Karun and of tree rings on ancient wooden coffins pointed to a large-scale drought, a mega-drought, a global climatic event known as the 4.2 kilo-year event. The monsoon rains in Ethiopia that fed the Blue Nile had stopped. The Nile ceased to flood regularly. Year after year, the black fertile soil turned to gray dust. The desert slowly advanced on the towns, and the material basis of civilized Egypt, proud of its order, the idea of Ma'at and its strict morals, slid into cruelty and a primal struggle for survival. In the tomb of Namark, Governor Antifi at El Ma'ali, an unusual message was carved. Instead of a laudatory epigram, the Lord left a documentary. It said that all of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger, that people had reached extremes and even ate their own children. For a long time, Victorian-era scholars explained these lines as a purely rhetorical device, a grim poetic metaphor used to aggrandize Antifi, who supposedly saved his city from a terrible fate. Modern archaeology, however, is ruthlessly exact and tolerates no poetic flattery. Human bones began to be found in the layers of refuse heaps of ancient settlements, corresponding to those dry years. They lay not in honored burials, but among refuse, alongside the remains of dogs, rats, and donkeys. These bones bore clear, deep, and repeated cuts made by flint knives. They were located at the attachment points of large. The bones were split lengthwise and showed spiral fractures characteristic of blows from a stone intended to reach the marrow, the last source of fat and calories in an emaciated body. Skulls displayed multiple injuries at the back, as if from blows, indicating killings and also traces of fire. Some skulls were charred from the inside, suggesting that heads had been boiled or roasted over an open fire, probably to extract the brain. All this pointed to cannibalism, but not the mystical, ritual cannibalism aimed at assimilating an enemy's power. It was practical, culinary cannibalism, cannibalism of survival. The people who built the pyramids, who possessed knowledge of astronomy and geometry, and created a complex theology, had sunk to behavior befitting beasts. They treated one another as prey. A neighbor could kill a neighbor. Parents could eat their own children. In the pyramid of Pharaoh Unas, erected at the end of the 5th dynasty, the walls of the burial chamber are carved with texts known as the pyramid texts. Among them appears a terrifying hymn called the Cannibal Hymn, in which the deceased pharaoh is presented as a celestial hunter who snags the gods with a lasso. Heka Unas, he who eats people, who feeds on gods, is mentioned as boiling the gods in night cauldrons and devouring their hearts and kidneys. Previously, such lines were interpreted as an allegory of spiritual ascent and the absorption of divine energy. But in light of the gnawed bones found and the evidence of mass hunger, these words take on another shade. They sound like a religious sublimation of a real nightmare, a reflection of the horrors people faced in those famine years. In moments of deepest despair, the eating of human flesh could cease to be taboo and turn into a sacred ritual of survival, a way to gain strength when no other options remained. Civilization dies of hunger in 3 days, and Egypt's grim history proved that. We are used to admiring Egyptian medicine, the Ebers Papyrus, trepanation, the first prostheses, early notions of but let us look at the life of an ordinary Egyptian not through papyri and monuments, but under the microscope and the CT scanner. The Manchester Mummy Project, led by Professor Rosalie David, examined thousands of bodies from all social strata. The chief enemies of the people were not crocodiles or lions. The main foes turned out to be water and bread, the very daily sources of sustenance that brought disease and deprivation. One of the most severe illnesses was schistosomiasis, a parasitic infection caused by trematodes. These worms spend part of their life cycle in the freshwater snails of the Nile. A person waded into the water to irrigate a field, wash clothes, or simply bathe, and the larvae penetrated the skin. They entered the venous system, laid eggs, and the spined shells of those eggs became lodged in the liver, the kidneys, and the bladder. There, the eggs calcified, as if turning the organs to stone. Traces of severe chronic schistosomiasis were found in almost half of peasant mummies, and even among members of the elite. This produced anemia, progressive renal failure, and persistent blood in the urine. When a person drank water from the Nile containing microscopic crustaceans called cyclops, a larva entered the body with the water. It penetrated the stomach, bored through the intestinal wall, and migrated into the tissues. Over the course of about a year, the larva grew into a worm up to a meter long and eventually tried to break out to the surface. As a rule, the exit point was the leg. The worm released acids that burned the skin from within, instinctively trying to cool and ease the pain. The person would plunge into the water, and the worm, reacting to the moisture, would release thousands of larvae back into the river, thus completing the cycle of infection. The only ancient method of treatment was the slow extraction of the live worm, winding it onto a stick at roughly 1 centimeter a day. If it was pulled sharply and the worm tore, its remains would be left inside the body and lead to a severe inflammatory reaction, sepsis, gangrene, and death. Researchers on the Manchester Mummy Project even found a calcified worm in the leg of one mummy, a grim but vivid testament to the diseases that accompanied the everyday life of ancient Egyptians. His leg had been amputated, and the bone had healed during his lifetime, but the man could not be saved. He died of infection. It was from the traces of bone remodeling that researchers understood the operation had been performed while he was alive, yet the infection proved stronger. When speaking of the ancient, their so-called Sphinx smile is not a smile at all, but rather a frozen grimace of pain. Bread formed the basis of the diet, and grain was ground on the simplest stone querns, from which grains of sand, quartz grit, and dust inevitably got into the flour. Such bread was abrasive, like sandpaper. By the age of 30, the teeth of many Egyptians had been worn down to the pulp, exposing the nerves. As a result, abscesses, cysts, and purulent inflammations of the jaw developed, which often spread into the max. Even pharaohs were not immune. Amenhotep II, one of the wealthiest rulers of his era, died of sepsis caused by a dental infection. Ramesses II, who ruled for 66 years, suffered unbearable toothaches in the last decades of his life. Tomography showed that his jaw was like one continuous bony abscess. There was no dentistry in the way we understand it today. Practitioners could drill the jaw to release pus. Traces of such interventions have been found on mummies. Apply honey and poultices, but they did not know how to fully treat cavities or remove nerves. As painkillers, they used opium, henbane, mandrake, and beer. The Great Pyramid builders often lived in a state of constant intoxication to dull the excruciating pain. In 2011, during excavations of ancient Avaris, the modern Tel el-Dabba, Austrian archaeologists uncovered 4 round pits in the palace, resembling grain stores. In these pits lay not whole skeletons, but only right hands. By the size of the phalanges and the density of the bone tissue, scientists determined they belonged to adult, physically powerful men. This is the first material confirmation of a brutal military practice already depicted on the reliefs of temples in Karnak and Luxor. The Egyptians and their opponents, the Hyksos, did not take prisoners in the sense we understand. They collected trophies, proving their valor and hoping for a reward from the pharaoh. The gold of valor. Small golden flies hung around the neck. A soldier was obliged to bring the right hand of a slain enemy. This was how they counted the enemy heads taken. Scribes sat on the field and methodically counted the severed hands, piled in one large heap. The hands found had one terrible feature. They had been cut off unusually cleanly, almost surgically precise. On the hands themselves, there were no signs of struggle, no defensive cuts on the fingers that usually remain when a person tries to cover their face or body. That detail suggested a grim possibility. Perhaps the limbs had not been severed from already dead bodies. Most likely, these were executions of living prisoners. People were lined up, forced to lay their hand on the block, and the next blow of the axe severed the hand. It ceased to be merely a tally of victims. It became a carefully staged ritual of terror. The severed hands were dumped into pits directly in front of the throne hall. The Hyksos king would step out onto the balcony and look down at the growing mound of genetic analysis showed that the severed hands belonged to people of different ethnic backgrounds. This indicated that the war in the Delta had turned into a large-scale Bronze Age massacre involving peoples from across the region, a true world-scale bloody feud. And then the modern age, 2018, Alexandria, a construction site in the Sidi Gaber district. An excavator struck hard granite, and at a depth of 5 meters uncovered a sarcophagus. It proved enormous, black granite weighing about 30 tons, measuring 2 meters 70 centimeters in length. There were no inscriptions, no cartouches, no decorations on the stone's surface, only the smooth expanse of dark black rock. The lid had been sealed with mortar, and the chest had stood untouched for 2,000 years. The news shocked the world. Press headlines brimmed with excitement and immediately spoke of a possible tomb of Alexander the Great, since the exact place of his burial remained a mystery, and he was, according to tradition, interred in Alexandria. The archaeologists, nevertheless, opened the lid. A smell so sharp and disgusting burst out from inside that even the people in respirators recoiled and ran out of the tent. The odor resembled a mixture of ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, and rot, a concentrate of death and decay. Inside there was neither gold, only a reddish, murky, foul-smelling liquid remained, a sort of mummy juice. Experts concluded that modern Alexandria's sewage had seeped for many centuries through a micro crack in the granite. The water mixed with the remains, dissolved flesh, textiles, and clothing, turning everything into that viscous mass. Inside the sarcophagus were 3 skeletons, jumbled together in chaotic order. Bone analysis showed they were young men. In one, scientists noted a hole in the back of the skull caused by an arrow or a dart, which apparently had time to heal. The man had lived with that injury. On another's bones, traces of crude trepanation were evident. They were warriors, officers of the Ptolemaic army, possibly fallen in the same engagement and hastily buried in an old, already used sarcophagus. But the real shock was not the archaeological find itself, but the behavior of modern, supposedly rational society. As soon as the photograph of the red liquid hit the web, thousands of people signed a petition on change.org. The wording of the demand sounded almost like the ravings of a madman. Give us the chance to drink that red liquid from the cursed, dark sarcophagus. People genuinely wanted to ingest what was essentially a cadaver poison, possibly mixed with waste and sewage. This mass mania was a vivid demonstration of how persistent magical thinking remains even in the age of smartphones and ubiquitous internet. We readily laugh at people of past centuries who, in the Middle Ages, used ground mummy remains as medicine. Mummy powder really was sold in European apothecaries up until the 19th century, and yet the modern thirst for a miracle often shuts off the basic instinct of self-preservation. And finally, a puzzle no longer about blood, but about technologies that do not fit into conventional textbooks. We return to 1936 and to the excavations at Saqqara, where the tomb of Prince Sabu is located, son of Pharaoh Anajib of the First Dynasty. These are items dating to roughly 3000 BCE. Among the usual archaeological assortment, clay pots, flint knives, and arrows, archaeologist Walter Emery discovered a strange object. It was a disc 61 centimeters in diameter, made of a sedimentary rock known as metal ivrite, or Metzildstow stone. The shape of the disc is baffling. It is a ring with 3 blades curved inward, resembling aerodynamic pedals. In the center of the disc, there is a hub with a perfectly round hole, and the walls of the disc itself are strikingly thin, in places reaching only 3 millimeters. To make such an item by hand, using copper chisels and stone hammers, seems impossible, because the stone would have split from the vibrations. To achieve such smoothness and thinness would have required a lathe, a high rotational speed of the tool, and milling technologies. The shape of the disc is clearly aerodynamic, and this did not go unnoticed by engineers at the aerospace corporation Lockheed Martin. They ran simulations in a virtual wind tunnel and showed that Sabu's disc generates a powerful vortex flow. In essence, it functions as an impeller, the working wheel of a pump, a flywheel, or part of a turbine, rather than as a simple ritual object. If you look closely, the object is designed so that water or air is drawn, and attributing its appearance to around 3000 BCE, a time when, according to the official version, the wheel had only just appeared and people used stone hoes. Sounds, to say the least, strange. Egyptologists have come to call this object a ritual lotus vase, and that guess raises a smile. Water would inevitably run out through the slots, and using it as a lampstand would simply be unreliable. There is also an alternative hypothesis, a kind of cargo cult idea. Perhaps the Egyptians discovered this object, or a metal original inherited from a more advanced pre-flood civilization. In this version, with hints of Atlantis and gods, they did not understand the purpose of the find, but were impressed by its form and reproduced it in stone as a sacred symbol, placing a copy in the prince's burial. The Sabu disc now lies on a lower shelf in the Cairo Museum, covered in dust and remaining a mystery to many. It is not conclusive proof of a linear, inexorable progress from savagery to pyramids. On the contrary, it may point to a different picture, the loss of technologies and subsequent degradation after the loss of acquired knowledge. When we consider such finds, it is important to take off the rose-colored glasses of romantic imagination and accept the dry reality. Ancient Egypt was undoubtedly a great civilization, but that greatness was accompanied by brutality. This culture was held together by absolute power and unquestioning obedience. Heirs to the throne could be forced to take their own lives and be consigned to oblivion. For the sake of funerary ritual, hundreds of healthy people were killed. Hunger turned pyramid builders into people capable of cannibalism, forgetting divine and earthly laws. Diseases wasted the body from within, and medicine remained a mixture of magic and crude practice, at times involving the use of the drill. And yet within this horror, there was another kind of greatness. They survived. They managed to create a sense of eternity in spite of pain, drought, and parasites. The screaming mummy is not a mythical monster, but a person who sought power and lost in a bloody struggle for it. The bones from Abydos are not rubbish, but the remains of people who believed in an afterlife with such depth that they were ready to die for that belief. We are their descendants, and the fates of those people are looking into the empty eye sockets of skulls bearing signs of trepanation. We see our own fragility and that fierce thirst for life that drove them to fight to their last breath. What do you think? Could the Sabu disc be evidence of long-lost technologies that we only vaguely remember? Would you, like the signatories of that petition, be willing to risk it and drink a mummy's juice in the hope of gaining eternal youth? Such questions cannot be answered frivolously. They require time for reflection, caution, and openness to doubt. History cannot be contained in books and reference works alone. It is hidden in layers of soil, in remains, in molecules of DNA, and patiently awaits the touch of a shovel to emerge again and tell what happened before. When the earth returns its secrets to us, it can lead to discoveries that shock and frighten, yet at the same time, bring us closer to a true understanding of the past. Huge thanks to everyone who watched this episode to the end and shared reflections on what lies beneath us. Keep your curiosity and attentive approach to history. It is precisely this that helps us see the present in a new light.